Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy in the Mess. This podcast was started because we realized that humaning during the pandemic was becoming a challenge. We are therapists and coaches and wanted to provide advice on how to human better. And specifically in this episode, we'll be talking about how to manage other people's emotions when they're bleeding on us and how to avoid becoming a dumping ground. With us today, we've got Sherry Timko, the relationship coach, and Matthew Morgan, our misfit coach. And I am Marlena, your host for today, and I am the dating and relationship coach. So as we get started, I'd like for both of you to talk about how do we experience other people's emotions and how do we sort of figure out that we're getting a little dumped on? Sherry, would you like to kick us off?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I have this experience of being in a grocery store line and someone starts talking to me and telling me all of their stuff and having to make that decision about, am I going to be empathetic and kind, or do I really want to just kind of turn around and read some magazine headlines and kind of shut that down? So experiencing other people's emotions goes all the way from that random stranger who is having some emotional reaction and sees me as someone to talk to, all the way to my daughter who comes and curls up next to me and has a total meltdown and needs me to help her contain all of that, and then everything in between.
Great examples. So it can happen for strangers and with our intimate and close loved ones.
I
And
find
everybody in
it's,
between.
yeah, absolutely. I find it's interesting as a therapist. I think that's a common story that we have. I don't know if it's the therapeutic presence or something, but sitting in a store and you're hearing somebody's life story and everything that's going on. And I'm like, dude, I was just asking you where to find nails right now. It's like, it's like, but here we are. Why not? And I think some of it speaks to the needs of people. Sometimes our opening as well. And there's definitely, and I love that term, emotional bleeding, because it's just that idea of they're hurting, but they're projecting emotions onto us, and whether we're just close enough to absorb it, or whether we're opened up to it but don't know how to stop all of those feelings from coming in. That there's so much that's involved with this and trying to navigate it, and it can really sap our energy as people when that happens.
And it seems like such a normal response or a normal human need to do this with each other, to be able to have someone who's going to help us either regulate or absorb. But when does it become too much? And when is it, I guess, appropriate, and when is it inappropriate?
It's easier when it's at the extremes. Like I gave the two extreme examples. And if I'm in the grocery store, there's no expectation that I'm going to really absorb those emotions. And so I have a lot more flexibility in what I do. And on the other extreme, when it's my daughter or my husband or someone that I'm really close to, that's someone who I do want to support and want to be there for. And I have a lot more trouble with the people in the middle, particularly people who are friends who need support, but also that back of my head, I'm not their therapist. So keeping those boundaries seems to be a much harder call.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It's a little murky.
the first one, and I will apologize if they hear this, but I'm not intending to offend by any stretch. But my wife will, I'll come up and she'll start telling me about some of the neighborhood drama, or about so and so is having problems. What do we do? And I'm like, oh, I'm not their therapist, But I think, and that that feeling, I think that's really what we have to pay attention to as people, whether we're therapists or anybody, is recognizing your own reaction to things, because I think that tells our temperature. Sherry, you're talking about the middling of this, that tells our temperature of how much we have. Because what I don't know about you all, but what I find is I start doing things like I don't answer phone calls, or I don't check email, or I leave stuff unread, because I don't have the emotional space to handle all of this. And then I think as that hits some of the extreme, what I find is there almost gets to be some passive aggressive or aggressive hostility of just trying to shut all that out because I don't have the emotional space for it. And so I think a lot of times just looking at how we react can be super important to handling emotions.
So really that's the ruler I hear is it's not really like, is this appropriate or not? It's sort of like how much am I open and available and wanting to be part of this in this moment? And obviously prioritizing from who it's coming from. Perhaps neither one of you are like, oh, I really want to be the intimate stranger or help the the intimate stranger. Go ahead, Sherry.
I'd add to that, it has to also be, is this helpful to the other person?
Mhm.
And I think there's this bias towards listening to someone else is always helpful to the other person, but I don't know that it is.
Mhm.
Like, we have to come from a place of feeling grounded and having something positive to give back. Like, it's not always helpful if I'm listening and inside I'm like, I can't take any more. Like, I'm not going to be helpful to them. But there are also times when they need to have some self regulation, and me doing it for them isn't actually helping them.
Mhm.
Because that kind of crosses into that like ambiguous term of codependency, you know. I love that term. I can care but not carry. And when I start to
Mhm.
carry, not only do I start to get resentful, but then our relationship also is compromised
Mhm. Yeah.
because they're not developing their own strength.
Exactly. And I think that's without going too therapeutic into this. I think a lot of times when we're raised in environments where, and there's a balance here, right? When we cry and somebody comes and says, hey, everything's okay, and we're never taught to regulate, all the external regulation has come, then we develop that pattern as adults of, I need to cry and have somebody validate me versus I need to look myself in the mirror and say, hey, you're okay. This, dust yourself off. And the first thing that jumps to mind, and maybe the analogy would be the kiddo that tips over on their bike and it's the end of the world, and they're never going to ride again. Versus, I remember my son when he was learning, when his first trips around the block, it was taking him a little bit longer than I expected, and he comes wheeling back, and he's holding it together, but you can just tell he was tough, and he's bleeding from hand and knee. The bike is wrecked, and he biffed it on the backside of the block. But I want to reinforce, I'm like, way to go. Like, you didn't sit there and cry and wait for somebody to come pick you up. You sought the help out, and and he thought, of course, we're going to be upset. I was like, no, we'll put the bike back together. This is now a father-son project. And I think as adults, when we reinforce that somebody's allowed to sit down and cry, they don't learn that. Whereas if we teach them, hey, I'll be here for you emotionally, care, sorry, I can't remember which one you said it, short attention span, care but not carry, right? Like, I'll be there, but let's come back. And so I think that's a huge part of emotional regulation, that where, Sherry, you were talking about, we're not doing favors by just listening and not helping in the process.
Or encouraging those healthy coping tools that they can
Mhm.
develop on their own and practice and use.
I think we've been talking about sadness and being upset, and I think it's much harder when someone has a strong emotion and they blast it out on you in anger. And I
Mm.
see a lot of that in relationships where instead of managing that emotion inside themselves, they come and they dump it, they blast it on their partner or their kids. And that can be really, really hard to manage.
Mhm.
Well, that's kind of brings me to my next question is how do we set these healthy boundaries, especially with people that are close to us? It may be easy to avoid the person in the grocery store because you don't owe them anything, but someone with whom you live or your child or your spouse, like how do you care and not carry, and how do you set healthy boundaries so that you don't sacrifice the integrity of the relationship or but you're still there for them?
Well, I'll be honest, this is something that I struggle with because um, I do think it's in my personality to be really empathetic and say the right things. and I can say the right thing that like draws someone out without even realizing it. So I know that I personally have a lot of challenges with setting those boundaries. Now, um, I do often have to like put some space there and just gently try to push them to like contain it or try to take some space for myself where I'm like, I have some stuff to talk about too. Like this can't be one direction. But one of my hardcore skills, one of my one of the tools that I use all the time is whose emotions are these? Because if I can recognize that they belong to the other person, then I'm much less likely to carry it or absorb it.
Mm. Yeah, so verbally sort of saying like this needs to be a two-way street, maybe even stating that bluntly when you're talking to someone. What about you, Matthew? How do
Yeah.
you handle a healthy boundary when it comes to this?
The first thing that jumps to mind with boundaries for me, what I always think of is how do I keep people away, right? But I think there's a converse side of boundaries in which if I look in my backyard, I have a fence on three sides. And that tells me all of the area that I can go, right? Like I can go wherever I want to go. I can have my garden here. I can have my shed here, the balls here, right? And this is a safe, comfortable area. So I think for boundaries, like part of what they really show up is how much can I give? How much can I give safely? What's there for me kind of thing. Um, and so I think there's a freedom in that one. And being able to process and say that this is all that I have is super important. But I can't go further than that. And I love Sherry kind of talking about the exchange rate of things. Like, what are we getting for our time? What are we, if I have my property here, like what do I have? What can I do here? So, the weird example here might be, and I'll use my son again as an example. I owe him another quarter for licensing fees or something, but he can get me a world's best dad trophy for all the time and effort that I put into my relationship with him. But I can also go down to the Goodwill store and probably buy him for a dime a dozen kind of thing, right? So my question a lot of times with that is what are we exchanging for the time and effort for somebody being in our space?
Mm.
Again, do I have it? Is this something that I can carry kind of moment too? What makes it worthwhile for us? And Sherry, you're kind of talking like verbalize, or Marlene, sorry, I'm having one of those days. Being able to verbalize and say, this is what I need for this space right now.
Mm-hmm. And how do you know if you're the one doing the dumping? I mean, we're talking a lot about how others may come and dump on us, especially as like therapists and coaches. Of course, that's what we sort of like signed up for, that in a paid role in some ways. And it's easy that our loved ones can, I don't want to say use us in those ways, but that we're skilled in those ways. But how do you start to recognize like, oh, perhaps I'm the one perhaps dumping on someone else. I'm becoming the intimate stranger in the airplane or the grocery store or with my loved one.
It's a good question because I think we've all done that. We've all been the person who's overshares in the grocery store line, and it either comes from a place of need or even just wanting to connect, or maybe even just being funny with someone. So I think that it's a really good question. I don't know that I have a straightforward answer to that. I think for myself, it is kind of shared airtime. Like, have we both had an opportunity to really talk about something, or have I taken up most of the space? But that also is not necessarily one situation. That also can be over time. So maybe there would be one time when I might be taking up most of the air time, but another time that friend is able to.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping back on the bicycle again, I like to point out that a bicycle doesn't have, very rarely do we ever get to balance perfectly. On rare occasions, if you're have a good downhill stretch and everything's flat. You can do the Titanic, top of the world, everything's balanced perfectly, but for the most part, everything is a constant left-right struggle. You pedal left, you lean left, you pedal right, you lean right. And when you look at the relationship over time, right? Like today it's a lean left day. Like it's a day I'm just going to dump and be angry. And hopefully I have a friend who's there to support that. And the next day is a pedal right day where I'm going to let this other person vent and absorb from them. And, I think when you look at the net gain of a relationship, are we building this place? And if not, how do we have those? This is where the external boundaries come in a lot of times. How do we have that ability to redirect and change it and adjust it out so that we don't fall?
Yeah, because sometimes we're just simply not aware, or the other person's not aware, of what's really happening, and maybe we've lost touch with ourselves and what we need or what's appropriate. And that's when we can start to bleed or dump unintentionally, when we're just really looking for some need to get met. And then we just, yeah. So when is it okay to start do co-regulation, or not okay, but when is it expected and normal to help people sort of manage that, rather than saying you get up on your bike and you bike home, but oh, maybe I need to step in and actually do more than that. Because I don't want, yeah, I mean, without it getting into scorekeeping with your partner, well, I did this for you on Tuesday and all of last week when you were having a hard time with your boss. This week, got to give me some massages. Let's, so it's not, doesn't become sort of demanding and scorekeeping.
Yeah, co-regulation is I think it happens naturally in relationships. And so trying to pull that out and say, well, here are the rules about co-regulation is really hard to do.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, what does co-regulation look like?
Well, for me, co-regulation is regulation is how you're handling your emotions, how you're monitoring and managing yourself. And so self-regulation is the self-soothing, the self-management, that's the tracking, the how you're going to process those emotions, all the stuff that happens self. And then co-regulation is that I'm grounded and I'm going to help you, or you're grounded and you're going to help me. Now, the real problem with co-regulation is when people really feed off of each other in a negative way, where one is angry, so the other co-regulates by being angry also, and they end up ratcheting up with that co-regulation instead of ratcheting down.
That is problematic. How do you prevent that from happening?
Well, what I teach couples to do is to, first of all, self-regulate, and then as they're able to co-regulate. So you're responsible for your own emotions. You're the one that needs to be tracking them. You can often see them in the other person because they become a mirror for you, but really we're each responsible for our own emotions. But once you get good at that, then couples get really good at co-regulating. And what happens in that situation is one will be upset and the other will know the right things to do to calm them. And knowing how to calm your partner is like having a superpower. It's like having gold in your pocket. So it's really important to self-regulate, but that co-regulation is so powerful that it's also really important to learn.
So it's not something you innately know how to do. It may take some trial and error to figure out what it is the other person needs to help them calm down if they're really upset.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, learning that over the span of the lifetime too. I mean, because that changes our ability to do things change, it changes all the time. Things that I was okay with 15 years ago, now I'm noticing I start to have a little bit shorter leash. The yard is a little more sensitive to people trampling on it. And I love that, Sherry, that idea of, a combination of things, right? Is regulating ourselves and also having our people there, whoever our people are, to be able to lean in and help. And again, maybe there's not a formula for balance. It's just weighing in moment by moment.
Mhm. Yeah, it is a balance. I like that analogy of being on a bike and like you're always kind of trying to balance it. And that's true in relationships with our loved ones. It's also true in more kind of distant relationship, acquaintances, friends, you know, how much how much am I going to lean this way or that way? And do we have a right to expect other people to help us regulate, especially those closest to us?
Well, yes, obviously, yes. So this is where I was talking about that extreme. I think the closer you are in relationship, the more that needs to be a back and forth and not one direction.
Mhm,
And so that's where the friendships, like it's clear the stranger, it's clear the very close family member, but it's the friendships that it gets much harder to kind of read and balance and decide if I give to this friend, will I then be depleted or will I not have something to give to another friend? So, um, yeah.
It's hard to know with friends because I think still there's also an expectation. There's some sort of mutual support happening, and sometimes it is very deep, and that support goes deep, and it's not just recreational, if that makes sense. It's more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see them more on that like a continuum. So you've
Mhm,
got closer friends and they do have more expectation. Then you have people who are further out. But like Matthew said, that changes over time. So someone might be much closer and have a much higher expectation of support, but then move out more over time or move
mhm,
in.
mhm,
My thought with this too, I've just kind of been mulling it. So this is more spontaneous here a little bit, but some of that idea of once we let our boundaries down and let somebody start getting close to us, there's a vulnerability that's there, in incoming and outgoing. It's one thing for somebody to see the front of my house, but it's going to be entirely different for them to come down to my basement and see the skeletons, not literal skeletons that are stored there, at least as far as I know. And I think that's, as we get vulnerable, some of that co-regulation can happen, but we also, I think, maybe have more of that ability to ask for it at times too, which again may mean, look, I don't have a lot of time and effort and energy to give you right now. I know you're hurting, and I'll do my best for you. Versus, and again, practically, it might look like, hey, I've noticed every time we go out, I have to be the one to initiate it,
mhm,
and calling that out in a friendship, because sometimes we don't notice that. It's like,
mhm,
oh, and if we're close, we might receive that as a constructive criticism. Oh, you're right. Let me plan some events, and that can happen with friendships, and spouses can even get in that same regiment where one partner has to initiate everything. And you know,
mhm,
when you bring up that vulnerability without directing it, then that's a boundary that's there, but it also will help regulate the emotions so that we're not hurting each other out of feeling hurt ourselves.
mhm,
I guess I want to weigh in here
Mhm.
about the value in specialized roles, which is kind of the opposite of what you're talking about. Um, Especially in a marriage, I think it's okay for one person to specialize in the person who schedules the
Mhm.
activities. And that's where you're looking at that overall balance. So maybe your partner would specialize in keeping the conversation going when you're in on that activity. Um, and there's a lot of ways that we do specialize that way in close relationships that when you can see that big picture, that all balances out. Now,
Mm.
absolutely, it makes sense that you would say, I've done enough of this. I've done all that I can do from my place of vulnerability, from my place of grounding, and I need you to step into that space as well.
Mhm.
Well, when I hear from both of you, whether you're taking on a specialized kind of role and allowing like maybe a little bit more over here because you're getting more over there, is that again back to am I feeling resentful? Am I getting benefit out of this overall? Like, I mean, so that it's not always feeling somehow one-sided or not mutual. And so this goes back to boundaries. Like, boundaries are meant to protect us, not punish the other person or make them do something. I always tell clients, boundaries are actually make the relationship stronger. It's not meant to take away from the relationship. So you say like, I've had to say, with friends, like, I've got 30 minutes to listen to this right now, but then I've got to go take care of the rest of my life. Like,
Mm.
and so putting even time limits sometimes with friends, like, here's what I'm available for so that I can be truly available and not hate you at the end of it. Like, not that I hate my
Yeah.
friends, you know what I'm saying?
This reminds me of okay, so I have a tallying head. Like that's the way my brain works. And it's not particularly helpful in relationships. And so we're talking about boundaries and like kind of balancing things. So not getting into that like tallying of, all right, you had 15 minutes, I get 15 minutes, or you had that conversation, I have this conversation. But also keeping in mind, one of my favorite equations is the attribution error. The attribution error means that I inflate what I contribute, and I'm going to minimize what you contribute. And that there's actually an equation for that. It's about a 20% difference that I will overestimate myself and underestimate you. So like we're talking about this very kind of theoretically and like balancing this and like kind of tracking things. And that very much appeals to my like logical brain. But I also always have to keep bringing myself back to that like I'm naturally going to exaggerate my contribution and I'm not going to understand how you're contributing the same.
I love that. I love that because that really brings back to some humility. Like,
Mm.
my perspective is not the only one, nor is it necessarily the correct one or even the fair and balanced one. And so, oh my goodness, I see this in relationships all the time. Like, what I think is going on. And when they check in with their partner, they think the same way that they've done all these things. And then there's some understanding to be had there for sure.
My first thought is the next time I do the dishes, and in the back of my head, I'm going, I'm always the one that has to do the dishes around here.
Mhm.
Like, all right, that's what, 1 in 5, 20%. Like, probably not totally accurate. So,
Mhm.
it's, I
Yep.
think
And so
good.
just checking in with the other person, especially if we begin to feel kind of funky about what's happening,
Mhm.
checking in and not making assumptions. I love Brene's Brown's. Like, the story I'm telling
Oh,
myself is I'm always the one to initiate date night. The story I'm telling myself is I'm always the one cleaning the toilet. Like, what is going on here? Just without the judgment of the other.
mhm.
And now we're back to in the mess because, all of this is
Right.
messy. There's not like a clear formula. There's not like a right way of doing this. And it may even be fair if one person has greater need and the other person has less need and they balance it out that way. So like this is all messy. And the trick is to
Mhm.
find like what works for you, what works for the other person, what works for the whole system, and that overall you get to find that grounding and be happy.
Exactly. And to communicate about it. I think that's just so huge. Just talk about what's happening, what you're feeling, what
Mhm.
you're experiencing. I kind of wanted to touch on high sensitivity too, and how highly sensitive folks can really absorb other people's feelings and not even understand that they're not theirs at all. I mean, I know I
Yep.
struggle with that personally, and I have highly sensitive clients who struggle with this. Like,
Yep.
Matthew, would you like to weigh in on that?
Okay, The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. Fabulous poem story. I read it as a kid, and it resonated. Like, this is happy. It's all about this tree that gives to this little boy, and it's like this amazing thing. And I read it as an adult, and particularly as a parent, and all of a sudden it took on a lot darker tone. It took on this, a little bit of a bit of boundary, missing here. And so I actually assign that to a lot of my highly sensitives, and they get mad at me because they're like, this is not good. This, like, we have this happy memory of it. I'm like, no, this is terrible. And I would say with high sensitivity, we always want to reach out. We always feel what other people feel. And we constantly give of ourselves. And in the story of the giving tree, that's the tree gives of its apples, and then its leaves, and then its branches and the trunk, and it's left with nothing but a stump. And I think sometimes we can feel that way. And what I tell people with high sensitivity, what I really try to do is get them to look in the mirror and recognize that that person in the mirror is also a valid person in this conversation. As we're navigating boundaries, those boundaries are just as important as the person on the other side. And so I try to, and I don't want to end the empathy. And oh man, the total side note here, but my empaths, one of the things is when our boundaries are, when too many people have chipped away at them and we start getting upset and hurt, I would say we have that ability to strike back with surgical precision and really, really injure somebody. When the average person gets mad, they just kind of flail. And a highly sensitive person, they will find that one weak spot and drill it hard, and then they feel terrible about it afterwards. So I say that's the measurement point. And then realizing we have to take care of ourselves in this process. Consider ourselves that way, hold to this so that we can maintain for the long run and we're not just left as a stump.
It's really fascinating, about the highly sensitive being able to really cut deep when they've had enough. And that's because they are sensitive and they know the weak spot. I'm sure. And it's their almost a defense mechanism in a sense, like, get away, I've had enough.
Yep.
Yeah, it's I've not taken care of myself. I didn't set those boundaries where I needed to, and this is the fail safe where I'm not going to let anyone go past.
Yep. Fail safe. I love that term. I'm going to probably pilfer that for some of my clients, Sherry. So,
What a fascinating discussion. And yeah, that's a really great poem to be a reminder, not to pour from an empty cup either. Right. And any parting thoughts or something that you'd like the audience to really know regarding this kind of emotional dumping and helping others co-regulate or setting boundaries? What are some of your takeaways on this topic?
I know for me, I consider it a real privilege to be there for other people. So we're talking about setting those boundaries, and they're really important, but it's also a privilege to be invited into this space, this vulnerable, sacred space where someone else is sorting through something, trying to figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to manage it. And so having those boundaries is important, but also recognizing that most of the work is being there for them. It's not fixing it. And it takes a lot less energy. You have to work a whole lot less to be present and available instead of absorbing or fixing.
Well said.
Absolutely. I think for me, we talked about the empath side, and I apologize. I'm old, so all of my stories tend to blur together. But I give my clients a lot of times the 3L methodology here, where when somebody is crossing our boundaries for whatever reason, when they need something from us, do they want us to just listen? Do they want us to help look for a solution, or do they just need some time to be left alone? And I think that's where, doing that, but also putting that on a mirror, particularly for us sensitives, the empathic people, put that in the mirror for what do I need? And, can I ask for that from my other people too?
I love that. The 3 L's. That is something I remember from one of our other episodes as well. And, I think I said this in a different episode, but the Q-tip, quit taking it personally. It's really easy, especially when it's a loved one, when their anger is directed at us, because actually it can't be directed at whatever it is they're actually angry with or what have you, that somehow I'm responsible. And the truth is I'm not responsible for other people's feelings and emotions. And it's usually not really about me. I might have a part to play in it, but the whole thing isn't mine. And just like recognizing that I am separate from that. And yeah. That's sort of my takeaway.
It's a good word, Q-tip.
Yeah. So thank you both. Any burning desires before you let our audience know kind of where to find you and any new offerings that you have?
This is such a dance. So a dance is also supposed to be fun,
Mm.
you know. So being able to be there for another person, but also like enjoying that part of it.
Mhm.
And remember, if you don't step on one another's toes every once in a while, you're not dancing close enough.
I
That's
love that.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love too what you said, Sherry, about it just being an honor and a privilege to hear other people's stuff and be there for them. It is such
Mhm.
an honor. And so Matthew, Sherry, where can people find you? What's going on in your world?
I'm at the Misfit Refuge. It's an easy place to find there. So we've got Instagram community, Facebook community building up. And I've just put out a free 16-page workbook on really some traps that we can fall into as a sensitive person, as a misfit. So it's a really great little self-start workbook, and you're just welcome to come up, sign up for it, and check it out on the website.
And that's free, right?
It's free. Absolutely. Yep.
That's awesome. Thank you. Sherry?
Well, I'll tell you about one of my favorite projects. I have a Facebook community. It's called Date Night Community. And in it, I provide conversation questions so that couples can develop that deeper connection with one another. It's where I hang out the most. So it's a good place to connect and maybe even throw some scenarios at me and see how we can kind of clean up that relationship between a person and their partner.
And that's also a free group, correct?
That is a free group.
Excellent. And you can find me at coachmarlena.com. I just released a dating profile checklist for people who want to get better matches and more matches. So anyway, you find the links in the comments in the description, and we hope to hear from all of you soon. Please like, share, and subscribe if you like this episode, and if you want to see more topics like this. Thank you all.